So, Professor, we'll start the COP25 summit, I guess you would call it, has been going on, started this week. Just give us the history of what does COP25 mean?
Well, it's the 25th Conference of the Parties. These are regular international conferences or summits that have been held back since the late 1980s, since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There have been a series of these international conferences bringing together policymakers, leaders from around the world to try to get them to, in fact, agree on policies to avert dangerous anthropogenic interference, is how it was originally described. In other words, dangerous impacts on our climate by human activity, by fossil fuel burning.
And let's just review what has taken place over the course of those 25 years. And I'm curious, you are most well known for the hockey stick graph, right, in terms of what has happened in terms of CO2 emissions and how it is spiked at one point in our history. Let's graph, if we can, to just sort of bring us up to date, where we've been over the past 25 years. Is it a gradual graph in terms of the alarm and the awareness of what's happening, or did 25 years ago did we understand what was happening and we have variations in the way that this is communicated to the world public?
Yes. It's very much the latter. Really, scientists understood back in the 1950s, and by some measure even earlier, that we were warming the planet and that this could have detrimental impacts on all of us. What's most remarkable is that ExxonMobil, their own scientists, in internal documents that were unearthed some years ago, actually characterized the potential impact of continued fossil fuel burning on the planet as catastrophic. Those were the words of ExxonMobil's own scientists. And in 1982, in an internal ExxonMobil report, and again, ExxonMobil is the largest, wealthiest fossil fuel company on the face of the planet and has spent tens of billions of dollars in a massive disinformation campaign to confuse the public and the policymakers about the scientific evidence for climate change and the threat of climate change. But in 1982, in one of their internal documents, they actually made a forecast both of CO2 levels, future CO2 levels, and how much warming that would cause. And the forecast of continued, future CO2 levels was contingent on an assumption that we would continue with business as usual burning of fossil fuels. In other words, that they would be successful in their campaign to prevent any action on climate, to prevent us from moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, from decarbonizing our economy. So they successfully predicted the CO2 level that exists today and the amount of warming that has happened since within the error bars of their estimates. So their own internal scientists understood what independent climate scientists around the world understood, that we were warming the planet, that this was having potentially detrimental impacts. And what I would say was that the fairly conservative scientific institutions that exist, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which operates under the auspices of the United Nations, it took them until the second IPCC assessment report in 1995 to conclude that there was a discernible human influence on the climate. But there are a number of climate scientists who had reached that conclusion much earlier, and in essence, ExxonMobil's own scientists had reached that conclusion earlier. The scientific community has been extremely conservative. By the late 1990s, the impacts were beginning to become obvious, and now, today, 20 years later, relative to the late 1990s, we are seeing the impacts of climate change now play out in real time on our television screens. They are profound. They are no longer subtle.
And we should say, as far as I know, there was a trial in New York literally just I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I think we still haven't heard it's a non-jury trial. We have not heard the Supreme Court justice verdict yet from the trial against Exxon for essentially misleading not just the public but also their shareholders as to what they knew. And if I'm not mistaken, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey is also suing them under a consumer litigation up in Massachusetts. Similar theory, anyways, not exactly the exact same case. And so, when I don't want to get too tangential with this, but what do we hope we gain by suing them? Is it to broaden? Like, I'm trying to figure out where we are in the fight to change the climate at this, or I should say to mitigate the climate change, and what we hope these suits will do. Is it to make the public understand that even Exxon knows this is real, or is it to say, hey, the billions that you're taking, we're going to take some of that back to help fight climate change?
Yeah, I would say it's probably a little of each of those, but primarily it is to take away the social license that they have had to continue to assault our planet through the extraction and sale of fossil fuels. In fact, the basic legal theory behind the RICO litigation against the fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil is actually based on similar litigation that was brought against the tobacco industry, anti-racketeering case that was brought by a group of attorneys general back decades ago, based on the fact that, as you allude to, they were misleading their stockholders. Now, you could argue the most profound crime that they've engaged in is their assault on our climate and our planet, and hiding the dangerous impacts of fossil fuels from the public and from policymakers. But the narrow legal case in question simply amounts to the fact that they misled their stockholders, because if there are liabilities that you withhold from your stockholders, that is considered racketeering. And what greater liability could there be to hide from your stockholders than the fact that you are destroying the planet that they live on? And so some of the same, I believe some of the same lawyers who were involved in the tobacco litigation are in fact involved in this latest litigation, and the parallels are quite remarkable.
We went through some of the history of COP25. You explained to us that we have 25 years of remind me again, the COP stands for, I think I somehow got it in my head that it's interesting because cops, we think of them as police who enforce our law. In this case, we're trying to enforce international law. The Conference of the Parties is an attempt to bring representatives of all the countries together to come to an agreement, a treaty, to act on climate, to lower carbon emissions, to make actualizable commitments to limiting carbon emissions. And there has been a history of these. The Kyoto Accord back in 1997 was an early attempt to impose some sorts of limits on carbon emissions. Of course, you have to get all the participating countries to agree. The United States, at least at the time, was the largest carbon emitter on the planet. China has since moved ahead, but at that time, the United States was not committed to the Kyoto, signing the Kyoto Accord. It was opposed not just by Republicans and Republican presidents, but by a large number of Democrats as well, speaking to the immense lobbying power that the fossil fuel industry has had historically.
energy. So there was the Kyoto Accord, and most of the countries in the world signed on to it, but the largest polluter on the planet, the United States, did not. Now we come to to Copenhagen, 2009, where there wasn't a whole lot of progress. It was difficult to get sort of an agreement that both developing countries and industrial countries could agree upon. There was quite a bit of effort to try to accommodate the differing sort of interests and concerns of the developed world and the developing world, and ultimately that resulted in a treaty, the Paris Treaty, a few years ago, that in fact did get large-scale buy-in. In fact, ultimately every country in the world signed on to this agreement, which included fairly stringent commitments to reduce carbon emissions. Now, looking back at that's 3 years old now, most of the countries are coming close to meeting their Paris commitments. Even the United States, with no support from the current administration, which has done everything it can to block progress on climate, but nonetheless, because of the progress that's being made at the level, individual cities and states and consortia consisting of states like the RGGI, which is this group of New England and Mid-Atlantic states that Pennsylvania is part of, that are committed to incentives for renewable energy and putting a price on carbon. Because of the progress that's being made outside of the federal government and what actual companies are doing, the efforts that companies are making, we are going to come close to meeting our Paris commitments. Here's the problem. Meeting our Paris commitments alone isn't enough. It doesn't even get us halfway to the cuts that we need if we're going to avert catastrophic warming of the planet. And that's why this current meeting in Madrid is so important, COP25, the 25th conference of the parties, because the stakes couldn't be greater. We are now at the point where if we don't make substantial reductions over the next several years, there will be no path towards averting catastrophic warming of the planet, typically defined now as 1.5 degrees Celsius, just under 3 degrees Fahrenheit, where we really start to lock in some of the worst impacts of climate change.
So there's a certain amount of inertia, and you mentioned that even like sort of the private sector has moved in the right direction to a large extent. There's a similar dynamic, I think, insofar as that the writing's on the wall that there's certainly no governments theoretically that one could imagine, no societies that are going to be more amenable to more carbon put into the air, at least in a conscious way. With a presidency like we have with Trump, where there is at least an articulated, and I think that there is a material hostility to dealing with climate change. What is the impact on something like the ability of a COP25 or, for that matter, COP26 to respond to the challenge if you have the United States sort of being the big fly in the ointment?
Yeah, the skunk at the garden party, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah, no question. And that's what we're seeing right now. The real harm being done by the Trump administration, which is indeed hostile to action on climate. It is today, we live in a petrostate. The Trump administration is a rubber stamp for fossil fuel interests, the fossil fuel interests that are essentially writing its energy and climate policy. The Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, who did Trump appoint to be his first Secretary of State? It was the former CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson. That wasn't a coincidence. And so we now have this alliance of petrostates, the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that are working hard to undermine any international commitments to act on climate. And here's the way they're doing that, the United States in particular. When Donald Trump says, he's going to withdraw from the Paris Accord, that actually doesn't have much really force of law behind it, in the sense that it's these agreements are, not legally enforceable. They're essentially just commitments made in good faith, based on the assumption that you will be shamed by your peer countries and harmed if you're not sort of doing your part. Name and shame is sort of what they call it. That's the enforcement mechanism. And so the real damage that Trump does when he says he's pulling out of the Paris Accord is it signals to other polluters that, well, if the United States isn't serious, and the United States is historically the greatest polluter, now China is adding more carbon per year than we are, although less on a per capita basis because they have a much larger population. We're still a much larger per capita emitter of carbon, and we're historically the greatest emitter of carbon. And so when the United States says it's not going to do its part, that basically takes the pressure off of China, which today now is the largest polluter, takes the pressure off of them to meet their obligations, their commitments. And what we've seen in the last few years, as Trump has signaled a lack of support for Paris and for climate action, we've seen China, which had been decommissioning coal-fired power plants and really moving dramatically away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, we've seen them now start to build coal-fired power plants again. We've seen their carbon emissions tick back up. And right now, as goes China, goes the globe. As China's carbon emissions have gone up, so have global emissions started climbing again. So that's after we had seen them plateau. There was even an indication a few years ago that maybe we were starting to come down over that peak and down the other side with our carbon emissions, and now they've ticked up again. And that is in substantial part due to the fact that there's less pressure on other polluters because the United States has signaled that it's, not serious about its obligations. The good news is that we're less than a year from a presidential election, and we have the ability to change all that, to elect a president who will be true to our obligations and who will once again lead, assure that the U.S. Is a leader when it comes to the effort to avert catastrophic climate change.
Well, with about 25 seconds left, the only other, I guess, potential for good news is that I'm not sure if it was COP 1 or 2, in 1987, the Montreal Protocol was adopted, which has gone a long way and appears to be en route to fixing, the so-called hole in the ozone layer. So the ability for human beings to respond to these things and save ourselves exists if we decide to use it. Michael Mann, I appreciate your time today.